We go. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us on this episode of the Akal and Kuka Report. Returning to the show is our guest, Bryan Carmody. Bryan is a pediatric nephrologist who practices at the Children's Hospital of the King's Daughter in Norfolk, Virginia, and is a clinical faculty with the Eastern Virginia School of Medicine, and is in fact an assistant program director for pediatrics at his hospital. Apart from his excellent clinical work, Bryan's notoriety comes from a relentless campaign that he has been leading online and in medical journals over the last 12 to 14 months against the US medical licensing examination, specifically against the way step one of that examination was being administered, graded, and then used for the purpose of acceptance of medical students into residency programs. Bryan was here on episode 72, which came out in March 2019, just a little less than a year ago, as his blogging campaign was gaining steam. And he returns now to share with us some significant developments and perhaps a little campaign victory indicated by an important announcement that the National Board of Medical Examiners made just a week or two ago. Bryan, welcome to the show.
Hey, thank you for having me. I feel like I'm joining an elite group, being a repeat guest.
Yes, it's very elite. Indeed, but let's start with the congratulations. Your wishes came true.
Yeah, so, something that I've been talking about a lot is that the first step of the USMLE should be graded as pass-fail. And as you mentioned, I've been sort of on that soapbox for a while. And earlier this month, the USMLE announced that beginning in 2022, scores will be reported as a pass-fail designation rather than a 3-digit score.
Okay, let me give maybe a 1-minute background for people who have not listened to the first episode or who are not, necessarily familiar with the issue. The medical students who graduate, who obtain their medical licenses, now universally throughout all 50 states, obtain their medical license in part through an obligatory licensing exam that is administered by a nonprofit organization to which all 50 state medical boards have delegated the authority to design and administer this medical licensing examination. And that's been the case for, let's say, the last 20, 30 years or so. This examination is in 3 parts. Step 1 is a part that takes place midway through medical school after the 2 years of theoretical classroom activities are completed. And it's an exam, at least that's step 1 of the exam, even though the exam is ostensibly a licensing exam, and therefore it should indicate whether a person is competent or not, and therefore be, along a binary mode of yes, no, pass or fail. It's actually an exam that is scored, and the numerical score has had a lot of unintended bad consequences, chief of which is what you call step 1 mania, is that because the score is being used by residency program director as a screening process to determine, who should be granted an interview and who should be, accepted into the program, the focus of medical students on that test is disproportionate and has ratcheted over the years a kind of a frenzy to do well on that exam, when in fact the exam should be just a broad, ideally should be just a broad test of competency. Is that fair enough for sort of the gist of what the gripe was?
That's absolutely correct.
Okay, and now after you're, presumably you played a little role in what the outcome of the decision was, but the board, I mean the organization that administers these examinations has decided that it made an announcement that it would change from a scored exam to a pass-fail exam.
Correct.
At least on that step 1.
Correct.
Do we know anything more? They made that announcement in a press release. Is there anything more that we know about their intention?
There are rumors that, and I've heard from some people who are fairly well connected that in the future there will be a move to make the subsequent steps of the USMLE pass-fail. And that's not something that I've heard from anyone at the USMLE. I don't think that they've signaled that in any way, but I have heard that in a few years, there's thought among people who are closer to this than I am that may happen.
Okay. But this decision concerns step one and will be effective in 2022 or something like that?
Correct.
Okay. What are your thoughts? What do you think will happen? How do you think that will change the scene for medical
Yeah.
students? Yeah.
Yeah, so I think that's what has generated so much discussion here lately, is that no one is exactly sure what a post-scored step one world is really going to look like. And much of the commentary has been that USMLE Step 2 CK, which is a multiple choice question test that tests clinical knowledge rather than basic science knowledge, will simply step into the role in residency selection that had previously been occupied by the scored Step 1. And I agree that the importance of Step 2 CK scores are going to be more without Step 1 scores. But I really hope, my sincere hope is that this is a catalyst for improvements in medical education generally, and improvements in residency selection in general, so that we actually can reform the system and make things work better for everyone.
Okay. When you were blogging and sort of putting pressure on the board to change, you were hoping for pass fail throughout all three steps.
No, I've really been opposed to Step 1.
Okay.
I have less of an issue with Step 2 CK, and Step 3. I don't think that many people really care much about it one way or the other.
Right, because that's a step that happens after students are accepted into residency.
Correct. Yeah, I think it's almost unheard of for people to really request or care about a Step 3 score.
Okay. And why do you think that Step 2, that the same mania that was triggered by Step 1 scoring, will not happen with a Step 2 score, or will not take place in regards to Step 2? Is Step 2, because I don't know, when I I'm dating myself, but I took the flex 25 years ago, or however long that was, so I didn't take Step 1, 2, and 3. When is Step 2 taken? Is it at the end of the third year or fourth year, or?
So traditionally, for schools that had what was considered a traditional medical school curriculum, where you spend the first 2 years in basic sciences and the third year on the wards doing your clerkships, in that model, Step 2 CK is taken at the end of the third year. And so even though the material that is tested on Step 2 CK is more clinically relevant, the questions actually ask about things that could conceivably benefit a human patient, the test's importance for residency selection is less, or has been less, than Step 1, simply because not all students have taken Step 2 CK by the time they submit their residency applications in the early fall of their fourth year. So it's simply a matter of timing and convenience that led to the importance and reliance on Step 1 scores to begin with.
Okay. And do you think that will remain, or is it conceivable that, or is there sort of a practical limitation of the timing, that, I mean, it's going to be hard to push Step 2 any closer to a time where it becomes a required application, part of the application?
Right. So I think many medical schools are already mobilizing to change the timing of their curriculum, to shift clerkships earlier. Now, this started, many schools have been doing this for several years, even before this happened. But I think this change will accelerate that. It will compress the basic sciences. It will lead to students getting into the clerkships earlier and taking Step 2 CK earlier, so that the scores will be available for residency selection.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so time will tell, right? As whether this will actually decrease this artificial pressure on students.
Well, I have serious concerns that it will. In some ways, it has the potential, unless we work to mitigate it, to make things worse. My problem with Step 1 was that students were studying more and more and more to learn material that's less and less relevant, to the exclusion of anything else, any other experience or skill or knowledge that could be acquired, because it was not tested on the test. If you translate that to the third year clerkships, I think we have to be very careful that the experiential learning that should occur on the clerkships doesn't get thrown out just in favor of dedicated test prep. If we go all in on step 2 CK scores, that will be the logical consequence, and we will not be better off unless we work to oppose that.
Right, right. Before, because I'd like to, you happen to be a program director as well, so that's a very useful perspective. But before we get that there, I mean, we have to say that, and I think we mentioned that, and Anish is of the view, perhaps, that the scoring, having a scored exam is not that bad. So not everybody is thrilled with the developments, with what has happened. Anish, do you want to voice your opinion about why do you think it's a bad idea or not necessarily a great idea to turn step 1 into a pass-fail exam?
Yeah, I mean, as we had discussed on our first podcast, I was totally on board with Bryan's fantastic campaign against the testing cartel, which seems to impose a significant cost and a burden on medical students that aren't exactly flush with cash. And I was totally on board also with the idea of the relevance of the test necessarily. So
you mean the lack of relevance?
Right, the lack of relevance of the test, exactly. Yeah. And so, so I think I was in agreement with Bryan on that front. I wasn't in agreement with making step 1 pass fail for, as Bryan's already outlined, what can happen. Some of the things that can happen when you don't have things, when you don't have an objective standard. See, the basic problem is, it is absolutely the case that it is a poor measure of how good of a doctor you're going to be to how well you do on a multiple choice test that tests, especially if it tests a bunch of stuff that isn't necessarily the most clinically relevant. No question about that. The NFL, the NBA do things very differently. When they're scouting, they send people, they look at game film. Every kid, they have a massive team of scouts that goes out and takes a look at so many different things. And so for them, when they come to the NFL Combine and they have a bunch of tests where they're measuring vertical height, what the vertical leap is and what the 100-yard dash is, all those things are put into context of all this other massive amount of data that they've accumulated. And of course, they're actually you have a process in college football, and football about, these are folks that are performing on a weekly basis and in real time, and everyone is watching it. And again, we have nothing like that, and we can't have anything like that given how many folks we have, and we don't have the resources to be able to scout like that. So you're left with, some type of imperfect way of trying to figure out who's good, who's not, and who's appropriate, for various different specialties with different demands. So then, to me, it seemed like the least worst thing is to have some type of an objective test, and for all its problems, it kind of ends up being one of these least worst options. So, some of the major issues I have with what's happened if you take step 1 to be pass fail is how do you, how does that help the folks that are the diamonds in the rough, right? The folks that are at Penn State and aren't at Harvard, the folks that can't get recommendation letters from, a professor that, is published in the New England Journal every week and everyone knows, and, that person getting a reference letter, obviously carries a massive amount of weight versus somebody at say a smaller school. How does one, we already have a problem with underrepresented minorities. Again, these are folks that typically don't have the type of connections to be able to necessarily do a 8-week missionary trip in some place in Malaysia, and be doing what have you to be able to put that on their resume. So I don't know how this change necessarily helps folks that don't have those type of connections. So I have significant concerns that this is not going to be necessarily a step forward. I would have been much happier if number one, the cartel had been broken, right? And I think what this does is it basically is something that the testing cartel or the testing monopoly, if you will, in this particular case. When I use cartel, I'm talking about, MOC and everything together. But in this particular case, this little monopoly that, the USMLE has, I would be much happier if we had said, all right, we're no longer going to use the USMLE only. We're going to use multiple different. We're going to use other agencies, and other people had other tests. I mean, for the SAT, the competition is the ACT. That would have been fantastic to say that, all right, we're not going to only accept them. This was a way for this little monopoly to keep going, because they basically threw everyone a bone and said, hey, look, we're making this big change. We're going to make it pass fail. You still have to pay us. You still have to do all this stuff. This is still vital for licensure because it's pass fail. So it just allows them to extend however long they're continuing their thing. So I would have been happy if there are additional ways to get kind of certified or licensed, I should say. I would also have been happier if the problem was, if Brian's big problem was, hey, the test it's clinically irrelevant material that's on the test. Okay, then let's try to make it more clinically relevant. I think there's a difference. I don't know if Brian agrees. There's a difference between a USMLE score of 190, somebody who scores a 190, and somebody who scores a 260. I don't even know what the top score is anymore. Scores of 260. The ability to, we've talked about this ad nauseum, and Brian will talk about it on this thing, but the ability to be able to get a 260 on the USMLE by itself isn't necessarily some marker that you're going to be an awesome physician, but it tells you something about somebody who can get a 260 versus somebody who gets a 190. That doesn't mean that isn't the end all and be all, but it's certainly an interesting data point that, folks are, it's interested to know. So, yeah, so I have
okay. We had, without, rehashing the same, the debate from the previous episode.
Yeah.
Brian, what is so now you're an assistant program director. Presumably you and your colleagues who are directing this program are going to adjust to this new reality. What are the things that you've talked about, sort of practically speaking? Maybe it's too early to tell, but I'm sure you've had conversations with the program director and your colleagues.
Yeah, well, to be frank, we're sort of a poor example of that, because we never used step one cut scores. If you applied to our program, a real human looked at your application and we made a decision from there. So it's hard, because even at a program our size, we get over 1,000 applications, for our program spots. And we are by no means, getting the most applications. I mean, I think the average internal medicine residency program nationwide has like 15 spots. The average internal medicine residency program gets 2,200 applications. It's just not a manageable burden. And that's what leads to this reliance on a number to thin the pile for you, to take that work away from you, to give you a manageable number of applications to read. And so, sort of to the point of much of Anisha's discussion, I mean, in isolation, making step one pass fail doesn't fix a whole heck of a lot. I think we have to do something to tame this torrent of applications that program directors are receiving, or people will never, you'll just gravitate to another convenience metric. And much of the discussion, as Anish has alluded to, has been around how this will affect people from quote unquote, less prestigious medical schools, people who are international medical graduates, because the reality is that in our current environment, if you want a program director to read your application, the only way to achieve that is by having a high step one score. So it gets your foot in the door, it gets people to read your application. But you could imagine if we had a world where program directors received a manageable number of applications, you wouldn't need a high step one score. You could go right to looking at your application and tell your story and show the distance that you've traveled.
So what again, I mean, why do you, if the score itself, I mean, program directors use the score to essentially filter out and reduce the numbers of applications to something more manageable. What will they do now?
Well, I think the reality is, like I said, if we do not couple this with other changes to provide more meaningful evaluations to residency program directors, and to limit the number of applications that program directors receive, they'll just use Step 2 CK scores. And in a way, that's a win because learning material for Step 2 CK is much more likely to help a future patient. On the other hand, like I said, there are some easily anticipatable negative consequences of going all in on Step 2 CK scores. And Step 2 CK is, it's a good way of measuring clinical knowledge, but it's certainly not the only thing that we care about in future physicians.
What do you care about? I mean, how do you measure the success of your residency program at the end of the day? What reflects most on the quality of your program, and what is your pain points if you don't do well as a residency program?
That's a good question. So, I think you can only judge the success of your residency program when you look at it in comparison to your mission. So for instance, at our residency program, one of the missions of our program is to produce pediatricians and pediatric specialists who will go on to practice and serve our community. So, to be honest, when you apply to our residency program, if you have local ties, all the things being equal, we really value that. I mean, that's something that we take as a sign of someone who already has community ties and is likely to help us fulfill that mission. Does that matter? Does that help you at every other program? No, certainly not. Right. But I think one thing we have to sort of get away from is that there's this idea of, the quote, top medical student who every program would want to have in every discipline, who's uniquely suited to be the top neurosurgery resident, the top family practice resident. I think it's silly. Different programs serve different missions. They serve different populations. They have different goals. There are different traits that lead to success within different programs. But if you outsource all of that human decision-making to a 3-digit score, you're going to leave a lot of talent on the table.
Isn't it on the program directors? I mean, the program directors want the best students, right? I mean, obviously they're highly, it's especially in these small fellowships, small residencies, neurosurgery, for instance. I mean, these programs that have these small programs, small residency sizes, they're super interested in having strong residents that aren't just score monkeys, right? Yet, if you will, the market is saying, okay, we are going to go ahead and, dermatology, interventional radiology, whatever it is, plastic surgery, neurosurgery, orthopedics, yet we are going to select on this score. I mean, don't you think that if it wasn't working, that they would have abandoned the score a long time ago? If it was the case that every single person who was a 250 and above, 50% of them were terrible human beings and terrible doctors and weren't able to, complete their residencies because, everyone hated them. Why the heck do residency program directors keep going back to that same well over and over again?
Yeah, to me, that reflects more the reality that, most people, by the time you're in medical school, you have been highly vetted. I mean, you were a winner in high school, you were a winner in college, you got into medical school, you survived medical school. Lots of people have looked at you and vetted you. And I think that the honest truth is that the broad middle of all applicants are going to be good doctors. And I mean, you can screen them out of your dermatology program, and it's not like, they aren't going to go on to practice and have patients that they take care of. I mean, even if you don't make it to a prestige program or to a, prestige residency. So I think that the fact that things seem to be working is more a reflection of the fact that most candidates, honestly, are pretty good candidates. When I read applications, I can almost always find something in everyone's application to honestly be excited about.
But Bryan, it's the case that yeah, I mean, obviously it's a talented group of folks that apply to fellowships, certainly in these high quality residencies. But residency program directors have had, I mean, since the beginning of time, nobody has forced residency program directors to choose high scores. Why are they doing that? I mean, they could have made it pass fail. They could have been like, all right, we don't care about the test, yet they do. So if you're saying that, how does it make sense? If you're saying that it doesn't matter who they select, whether they select a 200 or 250, why the heck are they selecting 250s? I mean,
well, yeah, I think that the practical reality is when you go through applications, you can, with a click of a button on Eris, you can have the software rank all the applicants that you have in order of their step scores, cleave off the upper scores, and now have a manageable pile. It's a metric of convenience.
In every neurosurgery residency, right? I'm just picking neurosurgery because it's one of the competitive residencies that has super high board scores, right? They have like 3 or 4 residents. In the big programs, they have 3 or 4 residents per year, all right? These folks are working 80 to 100 hours a week, or whatever, 80 documented hours a week for 7 years, right? And in those programs, you know, they're super tough, super arduous. They have multiple folks in each year that aren't able to progress, okay? So I'm telling you, it is such a massive headache, and you must know this as a residency program director when someone leaves the program or whatnot, right? I mean, call schedules, and how the heck do you deal with it when you have 3 or 4 people? It's a mess. And as they're selecting now, they have trouble with that. So again, I really don't think I really don't think the neurosurgery program director, if he had a better way of doing it, you know, I think they would take the effort to say, all right, we will only select folks that have awesome this, or we'll only select folks that, or we will shade, you know, folks that have done some type of military ROTC thing, or have been deployed in Iraq before or whatnot, you know. Meaning I have trouble. I mean, what the residency program folks want, correct, is folks that will are able to complete their residency, the 7-year arduous, you know, field type training thing that they have to do. And so why the heck would they not do better than what they're doing?
I don't know that that's what Bryan is arguing. I mean, excuse me, Bryan, I'm going to say, speak for you maybe, or at least make a remark here, that the residency program directors are not responsible for the establishment of the scored step 1, right? They're not responsible for it, but it's there. It's there.
They're selecting on it.
Since it's there, because it's there. It's there, and it's sort of a easy thing to deal with.
It's a headache for them to plug holes. Why the heck would they? If it was just so bad and it was kind of arduous, and then you could select somebody. I don't think Bryan is not arguing that it's so bad, but he's arguing that the detriment for medical students is bad. For the residency program directors, they don't care either way. They have the score. They're going to use it. It's a nice filter. It's easy enough. It's convenient. It can make their lives easier when they do the screening, right? They can apply the score. So it's no you know. No, but I'm pushing back against, specifically against Bryan and others who say that in general the spread in terms of resident ability is not that much, and everyone who gets into medical school, almost everyone who gets into medical school can do a neurosurgery residency. I don't think that's true. I think there's a very small percentage of folks that can make it through a neurosurgery residency. And I think the fact that the neurosurgery program directors are selecting based on the score is absolutely telling. And if it wasn't, right, even now with them selecting on the score, there are folks that don't make it, and it's a massive headache. If they could select on something else, they would select on something else, is what I'm saying.
I guess the first thing I'd say is that I'm not aware of any evidence that says that you know, your step 1 score predicts your likelihood of completing a residency successfully. And it's hard for me to even imagine that would be true within pretty broad limits. I mean, the residents that I can think of who we've had a couple of residents who have left our program over the years, and I think, you know, our experience is probably pretty typical. It's almost never a knowledge issue. It's almost always a personality or an attitude or a character issue or a life problems issue. It's almost never, you know, this person didn't have enough intellectually under the hood to function in our program. And I'd have a hard time believing that people who leave neurosurgery residency, which, like you said, I mean, it's an arduous residency that not everyone can complete, but I'll bet you that very little of that's predicted by a step 1 score.
And even if, you know, let's say that it was somewhat predictive, at least for maybe certain select specialties like neurosurgery. Let's say that it was. You know, why, you know, Anish, why should it be the role of the licensing examination, right, to provide that information to program directors? At the end of the day, right, the licensing examination is the licensing examination. It's a general examination of competency, supposedly. So why should it be tailored to help, you know, a minority of residency spots that are extremely competitive? Why can't they figure out their own ways?
Because they can't.
You know,
they can't figure out another way. If they could, I'm saying if they could, they would, and they can't. Again, this happens over and over. I think we need broader context. Look at India. India has, I don't know, millions of people that are applying to IIT, the Indian Institute of Technology, these multiple schools in India that are super elite. How do these people choose? How does IIT run around or go about figuring out who the heck is can go to a free Harvard-style education in India? And by the way, these folks that go to IIT then go on to become CEO of Google, right? I mean, these are like spectacular people. Again, they use an objective test that has little to do with what it takes to be a successful CEO of Google. It's just a resource. It's just a
No, but then they could voluntarily. I mean, they don't have to right now because step one, up until now, step one existed. So
Right.
if tomorrow step one disappears and becomes pass fail, there's nothing
Right.
stopping these surgery programs from mandating sort of a different voluntary competency exam that would be scored, that would serve their purposes
Yeah.
the same way that step one was. And in fact,
Right.
I don't see why that information could not sort of be kept blinded or, or used specifically for that purpose for the students who desire it that way. Any thoughts, Bryan?
Mm.
Yeah, I agree. I would not be surprised if the market responds to the absence of step one scores with more targeted metrics. I would not be surprised if certain programs are interested in that and want to have objective measures of, particular skills or attributes. I wouldn't be surprised if that occurs.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think I think the problem of step one mania is real. I mean, I haven't lived it. I'm not I don't teach medical students, but I can imagine that it's real, and I think it's what Bryan is saying makes sense to me. I don't know that this current step that the board has taken to make it pass fail will solve that problem, but it's at face value it makes sense that it could be an improvement, that it's distracting to be to that extent motivated by performance on a test for medical students.
No, I mean, it's weighted too heavily, and of course it destroys medical school education because nobody cares about nobody cares about these fantastic lectures that have been given by experienced great folks like Bryan and in medical school, because it's like, well, who cares about what Bryan's saying in this lecture that some other person is doing on YouTube that's funnier. But
Right.
maybe it's all about the test. So
But
we're not going to show up to Bryan's lecture on whatever and just study our USMLE step one or study our whatever board test prep thing. So no, I get that I get that it warps what medical education should be. So there's no question about that. But you know what? Then the solution is to make it a more relevant test, so that what Bryan is imparting in his lecture to the students is something that's going to be on the freaking test, as opposed to being some meaningless thing. That's how I would have.
Sure.
That's probably how I would have the approach I would have taken.
But
yeah.
I mean, what troubles me more here is Bryan is the fact that at the end of the day, you mentioned that one measure of success is to what extent the residents that you hire end up meeting your mission statement. But that's, I mean, I can't imagine that that's a huge, I mean, from year to year, how often do you, I mean, that's sort of a nice, lofty goal, but it really has, in my mind, it probably has very little to do with the reputation of your program or the success of your program, or you as a program director keeping your job as a program director as opposed to getting fired because the residents end up practicing outside of Norfolk and so forth. So it's a very soft endpoint, and residencies are not really competing. There's a flow of money that comes from the government, third-party payers and whatnot, that makes it reasonably easy for residency programs to get residents, and they don't get penalized on the basis of the quality of the people that graduate from these residency programs. And in that sense, I think that what's going to happen at the licensing examination level is not going to matter all that much.
I guess I don't follow that last part. I mean, if you ask the licensing authorities, they would say that is their primary role, is to protect the public by assuring some floor level of competency for all residency graduates, or all medical school graduates, that you've taken the USMLE, you've passed it, you can be licensed, you've taken your board certification exam. Now, whether you buy that logic or not, that's the role
Right.
into which these authorities have inserted
Right.
themselves.
Yeah, but I mean, tell me. I mean, I want to press you on that point. For you, as let's say you're the program director, the residency program director. Do you have sleepless nights based on what's the kinds of residents that you're getting and whether that's going to really affect the future of your program?
No, I mean, I think we do pretty well. I mean, like I said, and we get more applications than we than we have spots for. Everybody does.
Right.
I think the chances of a program like ours going unfilled are pretty slim.
Yeah, which to me is a problem. I mean, in a way, I mean, residency programs should be competing, and they should be right sort of a. There's such a subsidy into medical education, and it's not just that the medical education is subsidized, but it's just this. There's such a subsidy into healthcare that a lot of people are going into medicine. There's a lot of programs and whatnot, and it's and at the end of the day, nobody loses. Everybody gets a paycheck.
Correct.
Right?
Well, the
Right.
basic market forces. I mean, last year there were 44,000 people who entered the match, who registered for the match. There were 35,000 positions. So,
Right.
yeah, it would be hard for a program to go unfilled except by choice.
Correct.
Right.
So,
Can I ask you about this idea about relevance of testing, meaning the relevant material on a test? How do you should every there's a pathway to getting places in our academic lives, or in our professional lives, I meant to say. Is it the case that every test within that exercise needs to be somehow relevant to the end goal? Meaning, where do you draw the line? You obviously. I mean, I haven't done algebra for a while in practice. Yet, every medical student probably did algebra, did calculus, or something. I mean, there are all these like steps we go through, right? How many AP classes you take in high school? We study for SATs, and we take that. Where do we draw the line to say, all right, at this point we need to be testing material that's relevant? Because you would agree that we spend a fair amount of our time in our leading up to our professional lives and taking tests that have little to no relevance in terms of what we ultimately do.
Sure. So you're right. Tests have different purposes. So, a common purpose of a test is to inspire learning. You ask somebody, oh, why are you studying? Oh, I've got a test. And if the purpose of the test is just to inspire someone to learn, then it's not even necessary to even grade the test, to be honest. I mean, in the long run, that strategy won't work for the testing body, but I mean, you've achieved your purpose by even having the test. For some tests, the purpose is to stratify or to determine a winner, and so, tests that bill themselves as being aptitude tests, or, things like the SAT could probably be viewed in that way. But then there's tests like the USMLE that are designed for a specific purpose to, as a criterion reference test to determine, do you have the competency to do this thing or not? Do you have the knowledge to drive a car or not? That's your driver's ed exam. Do you have the ability to practice as a physician or not? So that's the purpose of the USMLE.
Though if you pass USMLE step 1, you can't practice medicine.
Correct, but you can't practice medicine without passing it. I mean, you have to pass others beyond that, but but you can't if you don't pass step 1.
Right. Should we get rid of the MCAT?
No, I think that there's a difference between, I get to ask that often, and I think it's worth thinking about why I think the MCAT is a distinguishable entity from the USMLE. So, the MCAT is a test that is designed, to provide information to admissions officers. And to the extent that schools use cutoff scores for the MCAT, I think that those cutoff scores are based more on evidence that people with a score below such and such are likely to struggle academically with the workload in medical school. And there's literature upon that. So I have less problem with the MCAT than the USMLE, which is a test that is, as a psychometric instrument, is particularly designed to discriminate at the low end, to discriminate the minimally competent examinee from someone who's incompetent. And then we take that and use scores at the high end, to stratify, even when what the score means at that level is not really well defined.
So the MCAT is used similarly in that folks that are at the high end get into high prestigious places, whereas on the low end, either you don't get in or you get into worse places. Should we take from that then that the MCAT is also not good in terms of saying where you fall within that medical school curriculum? Is that am I reading that right, or?
I don't know about that. I mean, I think the MCAT is better at discriminating at the low end also. And I think that many medical schools have taken that approach to admissions now, where they look at applications above a certain threshold. If you're below a threshold that portends academic difficulty, you're probably not the best thing for their school. But if you're above that threshold, then they look at your application at least to see.
So it's interesting you say that, because certainly how well you do in the MCAT has something to do with how well you will do. Because good test takers are good test takers. So if you're a great test taker,
Correct.
You do well in the MCAT, you are very likely to do very well on the USMLE step ones, right? There's a nice correlation that's seen in a variety of different places. But the other interesting thing is that things the USMLE step one I've seen get says, oh, it's a terrible test because Ben Mazur. One of my favorite social justice warriors, says that it's a fantastic test. It's a terrible test because women do worse. It's not a good test because minorities do worse. We're talking about the USMLE step one, right? But the same, that same distribution happens certainly for minorities in the MCAT. Yet that test seems to be okay. This test does not. It does. Does the fact that there's a variation by gender and by race, number one, do you agree that makes the USMLE not a good test, or is that your stance that it makes it, it's a sign that the step one, it's not a great test, and by extension, does that also apply to the MCAT?
Well, interestingly, differences in step 2 CK scores seem to be not as pronounced as in step 1. For instance, there's no sex-based difference in step 2 CK scores, although, as you pointed out, women as a group score 6 points lower than men. And so when you think about the way that scores are used, which, the worst part of our use of step 1 scores is the use of these hard cutoffs. You say, I'm only going to look at applicants who have a 240 or higher. Well, you think about the impact then of having a systematic difference in some group of, test takers and another. It's hard to say that doesn't cause a disparate impact on their acceptability to residency programs.
Bryan, if you, I assume that you look at the test scores, right, of the applicants. You don't use the score as a filter, but you look at them.
Correct.
Do you think it'd be okay if you didn't? And then you said that your mission is to foster sort of a practitioner, students who are more likely to stay locally and serve your community. How many of your students come actually from your community, from the local medical school, or from the state, or from an environment where by word of mouth you can have a lot more information? Or at least you can have some meaningful information about the kind of person that they are and the kind of residents they're likely to become.
Right. So I use the community thing just for sake of example. There's other things we look at too, but about half of our residents end up long-term practicing in the area. And, I think that's true for many residency programs because life happens and you lay down roots where you're in residency. But it is something, like I said, I use for example. There's other things we look for too. We have probably lately only 2 or 3 probably residents from our medical school who enter our program in pediatrics. Out of this year we're going to have 25 residents who match, and So it's not a whole lot who come from our medical school. We have some medical schools where, we tend to get a number of applications, and we often get residents who match. But I think that's probably bi-directional. I mean, we get better information about those candidates, but then also I think they're feeding back to their medical school that, this is a good place to do your training and you ought to apply here, et cetera.
Right. Yeah. How much, I mean, it maybe, obviously it's hard to measure, but how much of that sort of informal network, informal knowledge plays a role in your selection of residents? And if so, do you think it should play a bigger role? Would that be a good thing? Or is it, some people actually are very nervous about these sort of tacit channels of information, and
Right.
they're concerned about nepotism and whatnot and so forth. But
Right.
at the same time, it's valuable local knowledge.
Right. Yeah, I don't think we get a whole lot of that. We do get some. And like you said, I mean, a lot of people are very apprehensive about that, and I understand why. I think that, I talk a lot about how we need holistic review. You need to look at an applicant as an individual. And I say that because, a score is fine as far as it goes, but it's impossible to compare apples and oranges with a score. If you're looking at two applicants and one of them has, maybe some research publications, and one of them has, some community service they've been involved in, well, who's a better applicant? I mean, you can't quantify that. It requires a human judgment. It requires you to look at those candidates, and you can. I mean, and we all have our biases. We can't just say, "Oh, well, who do you like better?" And you have to actively hedge against that and say, "I like this person better because I think they're a better fit for our program because," and align that with your missions. Because otherwise, you're right. It does just devolve into cronyism.
Right. Yeah. Although, again, the problem, I mean, I go back to the point I was making earlier, that at the end of the day, for me, the program is that the problem is that you're not going to be penalized all that much if you make bad judgment calls, whether you use the step one or not use the step one or whatnot. Right. At the end of the day, the way the system is, your residency program is going to survive.
Yeah, you'll survive. But I'll tell you, I mean, if you do get some residents who are not a good fit, it does. It doesn't make your life, better.
Right.
But so we try to be thoughtful about, who's going to succeed in our program. There's certain things that, that we have learned that we believe help you succeed in our program. And those are things that may not matter so much for other people, So, at our program, it's a busy hospital. You have to be clinically ready to go July 1st. Other programs, there's more of a culture of, when you're an intern, you stick with the senior resident. Someone who doesn't have as much clinical experience coming in, might do fine at either or at a place like that. But for our program, we don't hold your hand as much as some places. So we look for that, just for sake of example.
Right. Bryan, now that you've had, you've succeeded in changing the mind of the national board, are you going to keep pressure on them, or what do you plan on doing next?
Well, like I've said on Twitter, if we just stop here, if you just say, all right, well, test is pass fail, all right, everybody can go home, nothing really much gets better. I mean, the only benefit in that case is that you have a test that's more clinically relevant, determining people's futures. So it's a small victory, but not much.
Right.
But there's a real opportunity here for medical educators to redesign curricula. There's a real opportunity here for residency program directors to actually think in a deliberate way of, what is it we're trying to do here? What is it we're trying to select for? How do we measure those things? How should we evaluate candidates? There's a real opportunity for reform if we seize it. If we do nothing, this will be not that much of a victory.
Do you find a lot of program directors? I mean, are you in contact with other program directors who think along those lines? Or
I think so. I'm going to get to talk to a group of program directors here in a few weeks, which I'm really looking forward to, because I think that program directors have an incredible amount of leverage in all of this. And I think that they too infrequently flex that muscle that they have. Program directors, I often hear them complain, medical school evaluations are worthless. Everything's pass fail. The dean's letters they look like an epic note for someone who's been in the hospital for 6 months. They're bloated and most of it's meaningless. But, they have the power to fix that. A selective program that says, hey, you know what? we're tired of getting these meaningless evaluations. We're going to deprioritize applicants who come from schools who do this or that or the other thing. I'm going to put that on our website, and when applicants see it, they're going to go crying to the deans, and their righteous indignation at being disadvantaged because of what their school is doing will be promptly fixed.
Right.
Bryan, what I'll be super curious to see. Have you gotten a sense of what the overall? My general sense is folks that are. I don't have a general sense. I just, Twitter is such a bubble and echo chamber stuff. But do you have a general sense of how this is being received by the world?
I think it definitely matters where you are. I mean, if you're on Reddit, I think it's a very negative mood right now. I think Twitter is more mixed. I think in real life, I think that even people who liked Step 1 scores, even people who benefited from, I think in their heart, they know that it's not the best way of being measured. And I do truly think that 10 years from now, we're not going to look back, bitterly at having given up this 3-digit score. I think we're going to be in a better space.
Yeah, I mean, some of the old timers remind me that they lived in a world that USMLE Step 1 was pass fail, and hey, everything.
Yeah, we had ways of picking residents. Yeah, it's not like things fell apart before we had Step 1 mania.
I'll be interested to see if there's a grassroots movement, if there's a Bryan Carmody Jr. that emerges on Twitter who tries to bring back quantification of Step 1.
Yeah. Well, I think that's one good thing actually about all this debate is that I think that's one lesson is that, if you care about something and if you want to keep talking about it, I mean, sometimes it does inspire other people to your way of thinking. And even if you don't agree with my way of thinking, I mean, maybe it'll inspire you to argue opposite.
Bryan, Race, I come back to this point. I didn't hear your responses. Are you worried that this is just a cartel move to, it's like let them eat cake type of move, meaning
a strategic
that's not a good
concession.
analogy.
Yeah.
Right.
I do.
Because let them eat cake resulted in her having her head chopped off.
Right, a concession, a short-term concession that they're making to the plebes.
Not short term, but meaning it just keeps the plebes happy, but in the end of the day, they're still sitting pretty. Like what have we done?
They certainly are. They're not going to lose with this. So I was very surprised by the decision when it was announced. I mean, if you followed me, I had said all along that the NBME would act in their own financial interest and maintain a scored test. And I think that ultimately it was a strategic decision to do away with it because the cost of maintaining a scored test to their public relations became greater than just, like you said, giving people what they wanted.
Right.
They had too much negative publicity about it, and they were ready to, retreat from that position and, build their camp on Step 2 CK.
And just to be clear,
they don't make any less money. You still have to pay the same amount for Step 1, or are they paying? Are you going to have to pay less for Step 1?
Well, so this is something I've written about a good bit, but you're correct. The examination registration fee is fixed. I mean, whatever they want to charge for it, we have to pay. But in recent years, especially with Step 1, they had made an increasing amount of profit from monetizing old questions to sell as practice questions for Step 1, or to sell to schools to give as part of their examinations during the preclinical years. So I do think they're going to lose some revenue on that. I think they'll make up that revenue with similar associated Step 2 CK products.
Mm-hmm. And just to be clear, that it seems that they've responded to the pressure, right? I mean, it's not like it was something that they were entertaining for, because they actually took a position about a year ago that a scored Step 1 was really a good thing.
Yeah, so this is my take, and I'm not on the inside of this. I mean, I'm completely on the outside, of the NBME and all the discussions, and so I'm by no means the only person who's been advocating for this. But they convened a meeting last March, the INCUS meeting that was that discussed this, and a number of people advocated for a pass-fail test. Then there was a period of public commentary that occurred last summer. And so, you have to take those figures for what it's worth, because it captures the people who were the most motivated to speak for or against the issue. But overall, the sentiment of that public commentary was very opposed to a pass-fail test. And so through the summer and the fall, I felt like, it seemed increasingly likely that the test would remain as is. But The NBME had, I think, other things that continued to make them look bad. In December, we had the financial conflict of interest article published in Academic Medicine, where I highlighted, the financial incentives they have in maintaining a scored test, and the fact that they're making money hand over fist, with these side businesses that they've created. And that, ran along with an editorial from one of the deans at Stanford, where he described, quote, crisis of trust between the public and medical education and the National Board of Medical Examiners. So that came out right before this decision. And then, another NBME executive, I happened to listen to a podcast where he was interviewed, and he was commenting on how, these high stakes examinations don't cause student burnout. It unmasks unfull resilience tanks. And I think he was sort of rightfully criticized for, making that kind of statement. And so I do think that things like that happened right on the eve of this decision probably made it easier for them to say, we don't need another raking over the coals.
Right. Well, you may think of it as a small victory, but whenever the bureaucracies, retreat, even if it's by an inch, to me, it's a great victory. So thank you very much, Ryan.
No, thank you for having me.
Okay.
All right,
Take care.
Brad.
Bye.
Bye-bye.